Powered by Libsyn, the largest podcast host and distribution network since 2004. Libsyn.com.
Welcome to Thanks Podcasting, where you'll get to hear stories of inspiration, transformation, and impact because of podcasting. My name is Reverend Gina Pond from the This Week in Heresy podcast over at thisweekinheresy.com. Now, I was going to try and do some sort of scripted thing, but I realized, my podcast I don't really script. So I was like, well, I'm just going to talk to the radio and talk to the mic and figure out what I'm going to say at the time I do it, because it just comes out better that way. So part of the Thanks Podcasting thing, as I understand it, is that you have to talk about the impact of podcasting in your life. And it's interesting because it grew out of another impact in my life, which was my seminary education. And I was thinking about, what am I going to do after seminary? And I had just graduated and I was just like, oh, what am I going to do? And I ended up listening to one of my old radio show days interviews with a band called Winefield when I was doing my undergrad. And I was basically the programming director for my college radio station at the time. And it makes me wonder why I didn't go into radio anyway or do a communications degree, but that's besides the point. Yeah, and I was listening to this podcast and I was like, that I could do that. I could still do that. I was good. Wow. And so I was like, I had this great title because I did a YouTube version of This Week in Heresy, and I kind of retired that and still had this great title in my head. So I was like talking to my wife and she's like, well, why don't you do interviews? And, you can interview different people and, post them online and see what happens. And so I started doing that. And the first interview was actually with my wife. And it's been an amazing experience. Because, I am a priest and I'm a Wiccan priest and a Christian pastor. People talk to me, I listen very well. That's why I became clergy. And even though they know that the podcasts are going to go out to an international audience, that it's going to be an audience that is from all over the world that they won't even know, they will tell me their stories and the most personal parts of their stories. And I realize that most of podcasting is like that. Even if it's a podcast with a specific topic, people will open up when there's a mic in front of their face. People will talk about the weirdest things. Like, there's some podcasts where, they're specifically about like electronics. I mean, I used to listen to the Amp Hour a lot, and yet they'd go off on tangents about other things, usually in relation to the engineering work that they've done. But, they'd talk about sexism in the industry. They'd talk about other things. And it's just amazing how much of a personal connection you can get through a podcast. And for me, it's been just phenomenal. My wife did a whole episode with me about asexuality, which is something that is not normally talked about. And that's kind of the premise of This Week in Heresy, is that we talk about spiritual experiences and spiritual things that normally doesn't get talked about, especially from the pagan and Christian communities and the progressive communities. My wife did this whole thing and it was a really personal episode for her. And she knew that it was going to go to this national audience, but it was important for her story to be there. I had another friend of mine, Tanish, a African-American out trans woman, who told me her life story. And to this day, it still affects me doing that interview and sitting in that room with her. And she's telling her story and I'm just letting her tell her story and realizing, oh my God, she is really telling me this personal information, this personal experience. And I'm the privileged person that gets to hear it and gets to put it out there for other people to know who the other is, know who the other person is sitting across from them on the bus, They get to know those that are different from them. And, I've had so many different people on, like my mom, my mom talking about the experience of my twin sister dying when I was 2 months old. My friend Denise talking about her abortion experience. I've had friends talking about their really deeply held religious beliefs. A friend of mine recently, my friend Paul, how he talked about going through and being in a welcoming and affirming church in a time where he was called a heretic for doing so. I have an episode coming up with a man who was in a very conservative Lutheran denomination and talking about how the difficulties of being for the ordination of women in that denomination and having your, becoming disillusioned by your denomination. These stories are just real. And podcasting has done that for me. Podcasting has let me talk to people that I never thought I'd really talk about. I mean, I've been able to talk to some of the elders of my own witchcraft tradition, Janet Farrar and Gavin Bone. I've talked to people from all over the world. I mean, I have an interview that I'm trying to schedule that I might be talking to somebody from Australia. I've been able to talk about a lot of stuff. I've been able to talk a lot about the Black Lives Matter movement with people who are actually in the movement, like Reverend Malcolm Bird, members of the pagan music like Sochi Quetzal Duty Odensdottir and Crystal Blanton. I think you can tell from my voice that I'm really passionate about making sure that these voices are heard, but they also really touch me. I mean, I'm changed with every experience, but I think the people I talk to are changed. And then hearing people tell me, hey, I listened to your podcast and it changed my life. I don't always get that feedback, but occasionally, sometimes it comes back to me. And to know that, I did a podcast that helped somebody grow or save somebody's life or, expanded somebody's mind and helped them accept the different and the other and the humanness of the people that I interview is just, it's just an honor to be the conduit for that. And, I was starting to listen to podcasts in the very early days. My friend Cece, well, I haven't really talked to him in a long time, but, Cece Chapman and some other people that I knew in the early days of blogging and podcasting, and I started listening to podcasts a long time ago. And, here I am now with my own podcast in this kind of golden era. And I hope that these stories will continue. I hope that I will be able to interview more and more people and I really hope that more of us who are doing these smaller podcasts, these different podcasts, will eventually have a voice in media overall. So thank you for listening. I hope that you will listen to my podcast because, hey, that'd be really great. I hope you support smaller podcasters, even if it's just by retweeting or reposting their work. If you can give financially to a smaller podcasters, if you really like what we do, it would really help us out. And, really support the people out there doing this work because it's important. I mean, for me, it's a ministry and I call it a ministry. And I think most podcasting is a ministry of a sort. I know some of you won't call it that, but this is important work and I'm glad we do it.
Are you ready to start your podcast? Host it with Libsyn, LIBSYN.com.